Hello, welcome to the second of the Sew Along with Sixpenny Memories. I'm just trying to find the blocks here. So we're doing a very simple block today. It's very easy. It's a great way of using up your scraps, and depending on what size that you're doing, if you're doing the 12-inch block, it's a fabulous way of using those little bits of mortar pre-cuts that you have available. So this is the block here. This is in a very simple terms. I'm just going to close that window again. Blind. It's very. So I've done two versions. I've done this one here, and I have done this one here. So these are both the 12-inch size. The sizes today are going to be for a 12-inch block or for a 9-inch block. So what are you going to need? If you're doing the 12-inch block, you are going to need 12 2.5-inch squares, and if you're doing the 9-inch block, you're going to need 12 2-inch squares. And the more fabrics that you use, you can have a really scrappy look, or like my blue one, I've just used shades of blue. For the borders, for the 12-inch one, you're going to need 4 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles, and for the 9-inch block, you're going to need 4 2 inches by 3.5-inch rectangles. For the last border, for the 12-inch block, you are going to need 4 2.5 by 8.5-inch rectangles, and if you're doing the 9-inch block, you're going to need 4 2 inches by 6.5-inch rectangles. Now you can use assorted fabrics. As I said, you could use a charm pack, which will cut you into that'll cut into 4 squares. You could use a layer cake, as this is a layer cake I have here, which is a 10-inch block. Or you could just use all of those scraps that have been hanging around and you've thought, what on earth am I going to use them for? So let's get started, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create this centre square, which is a very simple 4-patch block. And the way to do that, I'll cut onto equipment. Well, I'll go with the equipment as I go along. The way to do that is you're going to get 2 2-inch squares, and you're going to place them right sides together, and you're going to sew down here so it's 1/4 of an inch. And when you've done that, I have done a few blue peters with this one just to speed it up. You want 2 strips that look like that. Now, as it happens, I've just used the same fabrics. I've just used 2 fabrics. You do need a minimum of 2 fabrics, but there would be no reason why you wouldn't want to have 4 completely different fabrics if we're going for the scrappy look. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to place the fabrics on top of each other, and I'm going to place my opposite fabric on top of my opposite fabric, and you're going to get them so they're right sides together, okay, and that the seams, one seam goes one way and one seam goes the other way, and they basically intersect together. And I've got myself a little bit of a mess down here already. And then you're going to take that to the sewing machine, and I apologise that I haven't got a camera facility where I can be up and down them, but I thought if I keep showing you, so just look, can you see they're together, one's going one way, one's going the other. I'm going to pop it to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch. Now with your sewing machine, use a good quality thread. So I use the Aurifil 50 weight cotton thread, and if I'm sewing with lights, I tend to sew with cream. If I'm sewing with darks, I tend to sew with a grey. As it happens, I'm sewing with a cream on this one. It shows you what I'm sewing, but also because the Aurifil thread bends into the seams, you're not going to see it anyway, so don't worry about that. So I've stitched down this length here, and I'm going to open it up, okay. And what I want to do is to get this lying flat here, and so I'm going to get my Love scissors because they cut right to the end. So these are the Primlove scissors, and I'm going to snip into the seam. So I'm going to snip 1 and 2 like that, and then I'm going to snip into that one there, and I'm going to snip into this seam here, okay. And what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow the seams all to go in like a windmill and the centre to flatten down. So I'll just pop that along there like that, pop that along like that, and remember that you are pressing, you are not ironing. And I'll just open that up in there, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so can you see the seam is now opened up, and the seams are going all the way around. and I'm using my wool pressing mat. The wool pressing mat is available on the Sixpenny Memories website, so that's www.6six-penny.com. Now at this point it's really useful, just getting my little rotating mat, to check the sizes, and you can do it one of two ways. This, if it's a 12-inch block, needs to be 4.5 inches, and I can actually see in my hurry to sew it isn't quite squared off. And you can either use a square ruler, which is just very straightforward, okay, or you could use a normal ruler, and I'll use, actually I haven't pressed it very well either. I'm going to do it with the normal ruler, because if you've got a square ruler, you're just going to find the 4.5 inch angle. You find the 2 1/4, I'll show you. You find the 2 1/4 for the centre, and you just cut, and you only have to make 2 cuts. I'm going to do it on this wool pressing mat purely and simply because I found it doesn't move. I'm not going to cut on this mat, obviously. So there's my 2 1/4. So what you're wanting is the 2 1/4 line to go down the seam. I know it's not exactly on there, all right? And then this would be a 2 1/2. That would go along there, and you would trim off, all right? So that's how you do it on that one. If you haven't got a square ruler, what you then need to do is exactly the same again. Let's just get it the right way, Kim. Is the seam. So can you see if I get it this way? 2 1/4 there. So it just means you have to do 4 cuts. You can put the 2 1/4 down that centre line again, and you'd have to trim, and you'd have to turn each time and trim. And what I'm going to do is, it's well worth checking at this stage what the size of your square is, because if this is right, then all of the other bits are going to add on, no problem at all. Now, the reason it could be not as accurate as you want it to be, well, there's a couple of reasons. The first one is that your cutting initially of your squares wasn't spot on. The second one is that your seam allowance isn't as spot on either. And the third reason is that when you've pressed it, you haven't pressed it correctly. And if you haven't pressed it correctly, then it's going to be out as well. So you've got lots of different elements when you're sewing that can actually affect your block. So now I've got a perfect 4.5 inch block, and it just means that my next stages are going to be so much easier. So the next bit that you're going to do is you're going to get your, if you're doing the 12-inch block, the 2.5 by 4.5 inch strips, or they would be 2 inches by 3.5, and you're going to, if you're doing the 9-inch block, and you're going to sew 2 squares to each end of 2 of these rectangles. So one at that end and one at that end, and they will look like that. And again, use your 1/4 inch, and then you'll be left with 2 of your rectangles of that size. So remember, these sizes are for the 12-inch block, they're 4.5 inches long by 2.5 inches, and for the 9-inch block, they are 3.5 inches long. And you can just pop a pin in. I'll just pop a pin in here. So can you see I put it right sides together and popped a pin in? And I'm going to do exactly the same. And I'm using a Moda White Star on Star fabric. And I'm using the Indigo Gatherings charm pack. These are just the last bits of a charm pack that I had. I've got this on TV if you're watching this in March. So it looks like that, and I'm going to sew along both of those edges. Again, just using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, the other thing I need to talk to you about is the needle. You could just use an ordinary universal needle, size 80 is what I would recommend. If you want to use a quilting needle, because I'm a little bit lazy and I don't like changing my needles around, quilt needles are slightly sharper. They're geared up going through your top layer, your bottom layer and your wadding. They only come in 2 sizes, 75 or a 90. I tend to go for the 90, which is the slightly bigger one. So I've sewn both of those like that, and what I'm going to do is press. So yes, so your options are there with your needles, whether you use the universal. Universal is what will be a standard one, which will come with your machine, and you can buy them, and they come in various sizes, but go for an 80 or a 90. So can you see I've sewn those on either side there, And what we're going to do now is, you remember those 2 blocks that we did before, the 2 strips. Okay, so it's now looking like that. I'm going to sew this one onto here and this one onto here. Now at this point you need to have your seams going again, one going one way, one going the other, and I do like to put a pin in. And the reason I like to put a pin in is my pin will go through one stitch and onto the other stitch, and I can just squidge it along if it's not right. And then I always put a pin at the end. Okay. And if you were chain piecing this, what I mean by, or if you were making multiple blocks, you could easily chain piece all of these stages. You could make all of the centres, then do all of the first border strips, and then do all of the second border strips, and just keep going. So it you know, it would look fabulous. And I'm actually, if you notice, I'm pinning both sides on because I don't need to press after I've done the first side. I'll just press it all as one block. So just pin in there and a pin in there. This is just like my security blanket. I know that the seams have gone together. I think this one's a really good one to show you. Can you see the seams have gone together? They're lovely. One's going one way, one's going the other. But I just like to put that pin in just because I think by the time I've moved it to the sewing machine, it may move a little bit, and I don't want that to happen. So, do you sew over pins? Well, some rules say that, some people will say it's a rule that you don't sew over a pin. I don't necessarily think that should be a rule. I think, again, as long as you're using a good quality fine pin, then what you can do is you can sew over it, but just reduce the speed. We know we're not sewing at a million miles an hour. Just reduce the speed as you approach the pin. I will not say that you're going to never break a needle, because you may. But remember also with your needles, 5 to 6 hours of sewing time, then you should be changing the needle. I don't mean 5 to 6 hours of it sitting in the sewing machine, I mean actual sewing time. And the other thing is, use the right needle for the right application. I was told when I started a new project, new needle, and it makes an amazing difference. So I've sewn those onto there. So can you see? They're now sewn onto here, and I'm going to give them a press, and I'm also going to give you the measurements. So now this square, this block, should measure, if you're doing an 8.5 inch, I've got a little mark on behind there. If you're doing an 8.5 inch, sorry, if you're doing a 12.5 inch block, it should be 8.5 inches. And if you're doing the 9.5 inch block, it should be 6.5 inches. Okay. All right, so that's that done. So now the block looks like this. And what I can do is I can do a quick check and just check. Remember, I'm not going to cut on my mat, but I can see, actually there's a little bit of a slither. Can you just see out the side there? So I'll just take that to my rotating mat. The rotating mats we sell on the website, and they come in 2 sizes. So you can either have a 12-inch mat, or you can have an 8-inch mat. Now, if you're buying a mat for the first time, I highly recommend that you go for the 12-inch mat because it covers a multitude of sins. Okay, so the next stage is very similar to the previous one. For the 12-inch block, you have 4 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and for the 9-inch block, you have 4 2 inches by 6.5 inches. What you're going to do is you're going to grab 2 of those blocks, and you're going to sew a square at either end of those 2 strips. Okay, so that's your last 4 squares. And with the other 2 strips, you're going to sew them exactly as before, one on the top and one on the bottom. Now I tend to have all of my sewing in the same way. So what I mean by that is, if the last seam I did was the last sides, then I make sure that all my plain blocks go on one side and all my join blocks go on the other. Again, there's no rules, it sits easier. So just make sure it's right sides together. This is a great scrap buster, great way of using up all of those little pieces that we have. So you know, when you're finishing a project, you're finishing a quilt, and you end up with strips, why not have a bag with 2.5-inch strips in, have a bag with 2-inch strips in, have another bag with 1-inch strips in. So when you want to do a project like this, it's just so quick and so easy because they're all there, and then you can just chop off as you need. So I'm just, and particularly if you're using those Moda pre-cuts, remember your jelly rolls are 2.5-inch strip, 2.5 inches wide, and then you've got your layer cakes and your charm packs, which again can be cut into multiples of 2.5 inches if that's what you wanted to do. So I've now sewn on those two sides there. Okay, so I'm going to set that seam again, and I'm going to press it and then set the seam, and we're just about there. So now it looks like this, and you can guess what we're going to do is we are going to pop on those last strips, top and bottom. So again, make sure that the seams are going either side. Okay, pop a pin in for your security blanket, and the strips are getting a little bit longer now, so you might find that it's easier to pop a strip in, pop a pin in on the strip, because as you move towards your sewing machine, quite often it can move out of place. I also pop pins in to make sure I have things in the right direction, because so often when I've been sewing, I will know I've got it right in front of me, and then can you see I'm popping the pins in there, and then by the time I've got it to the sewing machine, I've turned it round and it's in the opposite direction. So it is really important that you pop a pin in, even if it's just for directions. We also on our website sell pins that are numbered, so you put your stickers on yourself, but they do have numbers on, and that again is really useful if it's for order of sewing, or you know, if you're doing your blocks and you want those in the right order. So I've popped this back to my sewing machine, and once again I am sewing the 1/4-inch seam all the way down. Now, if it turns out that your seam allowance isn't quite right, you may have to make some adjustments on those lengths, because the measurements I've given you are, you know, taking into account that your sewing would be accurate, that your pressing would be accurate. If it needs a little bit of an adjustment, don't worry about it. Your block might come out a little bit smaller, it might come out a little bit bigger. But you'll just have to take into consideration that if it is smaller, then you wouldn't need that full length, and you just might need to make a little bit of an adjustment. There are no rules as far as I'm concerned. Everything can be sorted out. So this is just about my last one. I know I did a bit of pre-cutting with this, but it's not taken me 20 minutes to get this block, and if I wasn't talking to you, I could easily get these blocks done in about 20 minutes a block. But if I was making a bigger quilt, then what I would do is I would do a lot of chain piecing, so I would have a lot of the bits coming together. So I'm on that last pressing. I'll press this very quickly. Got a thread there which just needs to come out. Don't know where that's come from, it's just appeared, and there you are. You have your very simple block. Now if we put these blocks together, that needs a better press. Where's the other blocks gone? But can you see, if I start and hold these together, I'm going to get this 17 by 12-inch wool mat. I've discovered that these wool mats work out quite nicely for a design board. If I start and put those together, can you see how marvellous that's starting to look? So it does have an Irish chain look about it, but it isn't quite an Irish chain. So I do hope you've enjoyed watching this. If you have any questions, then please don't hesitate to ask me. The email address is sales@6six-penny.com. Also, please send some photographs, and until next week, until the next time, I look forward to seeing you, and thank you for joining me. Bye bye.